I know it's a common practice to just say, oh, ignore it, ignore it, ignore it. But the reality is that often behavior we're able to ignore to a certain extent or in certain circumstances, but then we really struggle with ignoring it all of the time. So what I want you to think about is when somebody says, oh, you should just ignore that behavior, that might be really good advice, provided that you are able to ignore that behavior 100% of the time. So I know in some of the consequence interventions, we talk about extinction, and extinction is an important thing. So extinction is a concept where you essentially withhold reinforcement for previously reinforced behavior. So for example, your child approaches you every time you're on the phone and pulls on your shirt and says, mommy, 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 and you decide to use extinction. So in the past, you've said, not now, I'm on the phone, and you've given it some attention. You've determined that it's an attention-seeking behavior, and so you decide to withhold attention for that behavior. So every time your child comes up to you and says, mommy, 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 when you're on the phone, you choose to just ignore it. Well, so that can be really effective, provided that you're able to follow through and be 100% consistent with that. Keep in mind that with extinction comes a lot of risks. They might escalate that to start screaming or hitting you or even doing some other things that you just can't ignore. We call that an extinction burst. So often the behavior gets worse before it gets better. And for a lot of our kids, it's just not practical. You might be able to ignore it when you're on the phone with one of your friends, but if you're on a business call, maybe you can't ignore that behavior. You need to make sure that if you do choose to ignore behavior, you're able to do that even if the behavior gets significantly worse or it becomes potentially dangerous. So that's why extinction might not always be a really great tool to use. So when somebody says, oh, you should just ignore the behavior, the reality is that sometimes that's not practical and it's not going to be something that you're able to do. Especially if you're a teacher in a classroom, it's very often you can't just ignore the behavior because other students in the classroom would draw attention to it. So this is where the matching law really comes in handy. The matching law states that behavior tends to occur in proportion to the amount of reinforcement received for it. If I provide reinforcement for one behavior at a low level and another behavior at a higher level, then behavior will tend to gravitate and happen in proportion to the reinforcement. So the behavior that's reinforced more will happen more often. And so that provides us with more opportunities to provide reinforcement for that behavior. And that becomes building blocks for us to continue to work on. In the example of the child who says, mommy, 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 while you're on the phone, you might be able to provide a little bit of attention in the form of like a quick reprimand. But if the child does not interrupt your phone call by saying, mommy, 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 you might be able to provide a whole lot of reinforcement after your brief phone call. Then the behavior that receives more reinforcement is likely to happen more often. This is really effective if you can teach that skill ahead of time and if you can teach what you're trying to reinforce. For example, in that situation where the child's saying, mommy, 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 if before you get on a phone call, you say, first play with your favorite toys, and then you can play with mommy. You're setting up the child to engage in something that she really likes. And while you're on the phone call, perhaps you can provide some attention in the form of like a quick thumbs up or a high five, a pat on the back, rubbing her head, some sort of physical contact that doesn't necessarily interfere with your ability to have that conversation that you're trying to have. So if you can provide that reinforcement while she's not interrupting you, then that's going to be a stronger behavior for her. That's what is really valuable about the matching law, is that you don't necessarily have to just ignore the behavior. I know, especially for parents, it can just feel wrong to completely ignore a behavior. That doesn't mean that we want to start instilling a bunch of punishment or those traditional parenting consequences. But very often we feel like we at least need to reprimand in some way. I still don't think that that's necessary most of the time, but I do recognize that it's kind of instinctual for a lot of parents. And in a school, if you're a teacher, your administrators are probably expecting that you address the challenging behavior at least in some way, because they don't necessarily understand. If it's a behavior that's maintained by attention, then providing those types of reprimands can be really reinforcing. So we want to make sure that whatever behaviors we're looking for in place of those challenging behaviors receives just higher quality reinforcement. That means that it's something that the child values more than the reinforcer they're receiving for the challenging behavior. If the child enjoys that physical contact and maybe playing something special with mom, then that's going to be a stronger reinforcer than a really quick reprimand, not now, I'm on the phone. Keep in mind the different qualities of a reinforcer that are important to your child. That might be using a different type of reinforcer. You might just provide a quick reprimand for the interruption, but you might provide some attention along with some special toy that only comes out as a reinforcer. Maybe it's something that your child really enjoys and mom engages in that activity with the child once the phone call is over. Other qualities that impact reinforcer effectiveness include things like durations. A really quick reprimand versus 15 minutes of quality one-on-one time with mom. The duration really can impact how motivating a reinforcer is. Just keep those things in mind as you're learning about the matching law. I really want you to kind of think about that in terms of when you receive advice, because you undoubtedly will receive advice to, oh, just ignore it. Well, keep in mind, if it's not something that you can ignore all of the time, then it's not going to work. Not the way that you want it to. So you're going to need to use something else, and the matching law can be a really useful tool for that.